I am 72, and tonight is the night I finally understood my place in my own son's story. The air off the Oregon coast was thick with the scent of salt and pine, the kind of evening that promises beautiful memories. From the lawn, I could hear the string quartet, a sound I had chosen myself. I wore a pale silk dress and the pearls my mother gave me, believing they still meant something in this family. But instead of being led toward the long candlelit tables, I was quietly steered through a side door. The warm laughter faded, replaced by the clatter of plates. They seated me in the kitchen. In that moment, I wasn't the mother of the groom, I was simply in the way. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. I am Catherine Davenport. For 72 years, I have called the misty coastline of Seacrest, Oregon, my home. My story is etched into the very architecture of this town. From the clean, sweeping lines of the Seacrest Art Museum to the cozy, light-filled homes nestled in the hills overlooking the Pacific. I built a life and a legacy here with my own two hands, turning a small drafting table in my dining room into Davenport Designs, a name that became synonymous with quiet elegance and unyielding quality. My work was my identity, a testament to the belief that a well-designed space could shape a well-lived life. It was a language I understood better than any other. After my husband passed, leaving a silence that echoed louder than any storm, the company became my everything. It was my shield, my purpose, and the vessel into which I poured all my grief and all my hope. And then there was Thomas, my son. He was the soft light in the quiet corners of my life, the one constant I held on to. I watched him grow up among blueprints and fabric swatches, his small hands tracing the lines I drew. My greatest pride wasn't in the magazine features or the industry awards. It was in the moment Thomas, fresh out of university with a degree in business, said he wanted to join the firm. He didn't want to design, he wanted to build the business, to take my foundation and erect an empire upon it. I saw the future of Davenport Designs in his eyes, a future that stretched far beyond my own lifetime. For years, we were a perfect partnership. I was the heart and soul, the creative force that gave the company its signature aesthetic. Thomas was the engine, the sharp strategic mind that expanded our reach and modernized our operations. He understood the legacy, or so I believed. He respected the story behind every design, every client relationship I had cultivated over decades. The house I had built was in perfect order. But a house, no matter how strong its foundation, can be changed by the people you let inside. And I had opened the door for Jessica. Jessica, or Jess, as she insisted on being called, entered our lives like a perfectly executed design, flawless on the surface, every element precisely placed. She was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed a charm that could disarm even the most seasoned skeptic. When Thomas introduced her, I saw a reflection of his own ambition in her eyes, and I welcomed it. I saw her as the final, beautiful piece of the life my son was building for himself. I hosted dinners, shared family stories, and walked her through the archives of my earliest work, believing I was welcoming a daughter, not an adversary. The changes started slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was small suggestions in board meetings, phrased so cleverly they sounded like enhancements of my original ideas. A new marketing slogan here, a modern tweak to our logo there. I attributed it to her fresh perspective, her desire to make her mark. I told myself that letting go was a necessary part of growth, that a legacy isn't a museum piece to be preserved under glass, but a living thing that must evolve. Thomas was so happy, so utterly captivated by her, that to question her motives felt like a betrayal of his happiness. So I stayed quiet, watching from the position I had willingly begun to cede the founder, the matriarch, the respected elder looking on as the next generation took the reins. The first crack in that carefully constructed piece appeared not with a bang, but with the glossy sheen of a page in a high-end design magazine. I was in my private study. a room overlooking the sea where I still kept my old drafting table. When I saw it, it was an 8-page spread on the new face of Pacific Northwest design, featuring Davenport designs. But the faces smiling back at me were not mine. They were Thomas and Jess. Posed in a home I had designed years ago, presented as the visionary couple redefining coastal living. The article was filled with quotes from Jess, speaking eloquently about our vision and our philosophy. Even then, I tried to rationalize it. It was marketing. It was about the future, not the past. But my unease deepened, settling into a cold knot in my stomach. The true blow came a week later. My head of design, a man who had worked with me for 30 years, placed our new fall catalog on my desk with a look of quiet apology in his eyes. On the cover was our newest line, a collection of artisanal wallpapers. It was a project I had poured my heart into, a series of intricate patterns inspired by the wildflowers and orchards of my childhood. I had called it the Orchard Collection, a name that held personal meaning, a quiet nod to the memory of my father. But that was not the name in the catalog. In bold, elegant script, the collection was titled Sterling and Vance, a fusion of Jessica's last name, Sterling, and my own. The description, written in Jess's unmistakable prose, spoke of a dynamic fusion of classic heritage and modern sensibility, a collaborative masterpiece that launched a new era for the company. There was no mention of my inspiration, no hint of the story behind the designs. My life's work, my memories, had been curated, rebranded, and presented as a joint creation. I had not been erased completely, just edited down to a supporting role in my own story. My name now a classic heritage for her modern sensibility to build upon. I closed the catalog and felt a profound, chilling silence, like the house was no longer in order. A stranger was moving the furniture around, and I had foolishly handed her the keys. That quiet act of erasure changed something fundamental within me. It was a clarification, a harsh light thrown onto a scene I had previously allowed to remain in soft focus. Every interaction that followed was viewed through this new, sharp lens. I began to see the patterns I had missed, the meetings I wasn't invited to, the client decisions that were made without my input, the subtle ways Jess would rephrase my history in conversation to position herself as the heir to a throne I hadn't yet vacated. My politeness became a form of observation. My silence became a tool for listening. The wedding preparations began in earnest, a grand affair planned for a historic estate overlooking the dramatic cliffs of Seacrest. It was to be the social event of the season, a public declaration not only of a marriage but of the new power couple at the helm of the town's most respected design firm. I played my part, attending tastings and venue tours with a serene smile, all while a quiet watchfulness settled deep within me. I was no longer just the mother of the groom. I was a student of human nature, watching a masterclass in ambition. The next test, the next move in this quiet, undeclared game, came 2 weeks before the wedding day. It didn't come from Jess directly. Her methods were far too sophisticated for that. It came via her assistant, a young woman with a voice as smooth and polished as Riverstone, who called my personal assistant. Anne. Anne has been with me for 40 years, a silent witness to my entire career. She is more than an employee, she is the keeper of my schedule, my history, and often, my sanity. She came into my study that afternoon, her face impassive but her eyes conveying a familiar sense of concern. Catherine, she began, holding a notepad, I've just had a call from Jessica's assistant. Vogue is doing a feature on the wedding, and they are planning a pre-wedding photo shoot with Jessica at the estate. The theme is Modern Legacy. Anne paused, letting the carefully chosen words hang in the air. They have requested access to the Davenport family vault. Jessica's stylist has a list of items she would like to borrow for the shoot. I remained silent, looking out at the gray expanse of the Pacific, and waited. Anne continued, her voice flat, merely reporting the facts. She mentioned your grandmother's sapphire ring, your mother's pearl and ivory hair comb. and the diamond brooch that has been worn by every Davenport bride on her wedding day for the last 4 generations. A final, devastating detail. The assistant mentioned that Jessica told them you had already given your enthusiastic approval. This was it. This was the move that went beyond the business. The company was one thing, it was built of paper and wood and ideas. But these heirlooms were built of memory and bone. They were the physical embodiment of the women who came before me. Their stories held in the cool weight of the gems and the soft patina of the ivory. For Jess to request them was audacious. To lie and say I had already agreed was a declaration. It was a power play of the highest order, a calculated attempt to physically drape herself in my family's history, to wear our legacy as a costume for a magazine. Anne watched me, waiting for the outrage, for the instruction to shut it down immediately. I could see the refusal already formed on her lips, ready to be deployed on my behalf. But the cold clarity that had settled in me since the wallpaper incident held me still. Outrage was a fire that consumed itself. What I needed was not heat, but light. I turned from the window to look at my oldest friend. Anne, I said, my voice perfectly even. Call her back. Tell her the vault will be made available to them at the requested time. Anne's composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face. Catherine, you can't be serious. That brooch? I am perfectly serious, I interrupted gently. Let her have them. Let her wear them for the cameras. Let her feel the weight of them on her skin. I stood up and walked over to my desk, running a hand over the smooth, aged wood. We need to know, I said, as much to myself as to Anne. We need to see just how comfortable a person can get, wearing a story that isn't theirs. Anne simply nodded, the flicker of protest replaced by a deep, quiet understanding. The game had been set, and I had just made my first move. I would not fight for the pieces, I would simply let my opponent take them, and watch to see where she would place them on the board. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite inquiries. I moved through the necessary motions of the mother of the groom, my public face a mask of serene contentment. Inside, however, I was a silent observer, a watchmaker studying the intricate, deceptive movements of a beautifully crafted, but ultimately flawed, machine. I saw the way Jess wore my family's history. Not just the jewels, she would drop anecdotes I had shared with her into conversations, positioning herself as the natural inheritor of a story she had only just learned. She was a quick study. She understood that legacy, like wealth, was a currency, and she was spending mine with remarkable confidence. Then came the day of the wedding. It dawned crisp and clear. The Oregon sky, a vast, pale blue canvas. The estate was a masterpiece, a place I myself had consulted on years ago. Every detail was perfect, the scent of salt and magnolia, the distant sound of the string quartet, the soft murmur of guests. I wore a gown of pale, celadon silk, and around my neck were the pearls my mother had given me, the only heirloom I had kept for myself. They felt cool and solid against my skin, a familiar weight in a world that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. As I moved through the welcoming line, I could see Thomas and Jess standing under a grand arch of white roses. The picture of happiness? Jess was radiant on her finger. My grandmother's sapphire glittered. Tucked into her elegant chignon was my mother's ivory comb. They looked as if they belonged to her. The sight did not spark anger in me, but a deep, cold sorrow. It was the sorrow of watching a beautiful old tree being stripped of its leaves. One by one, I performed my role flawlessly, smiling, accepting compliments on my son's behalf. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows exchanged as the sun began its slow descent toward the Pacific. As the guests moved to the grand pavilion for the reception, a quiet dread settled over me. The seating chart, a document Jess had personally overseen, would be the final, public statement of my new place. I saw my friends finding their tables, long banquet tables adorned with candles and flowers. I began scanning the place cards at the main table, looking for my name, expecting to see it next to Thomas. for a fleeting moment. I allowed myself to think I had been wrong. But as I moved forward, a young woman in a crisp staff uniform intercepted me. She was barely out of her teens, her eyes wide with a nervous deference. "Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice a low, rehearsed murmur. "Your table is ready, please. Come this way." She did not lead me toward the head table. Instead, she guided me away from the warmth and light of the pavilion, away from the laughter and the music, toward a discreet side door I had never noticed before. The walk was perhaps only 50 feet, but it felt like a mile. The sound of the party grew more distant, replaced by the purposeful clatter of a commercial kitchen. She pushed the door open, and the scent of magnolias was instantly overwhelmed by the smell of seared scallops. We were in a narrow, brightly lit hallway. At the end of the hall was a small, cluttered room, a staging area. And there, wedged between a rolling cart stacked with plates and the swinging door to the kitchen, was a small, unadorned round table with a single chair. "Here you are, Mrs. Davenport," the young woman said. Her duty done, she vanished before I could respond. I stood there for a long moment, the sounds of my son's wedding filtering through the wall as a muffled hum. This was not an oversight. An oversight is a name misspelled. This was a statement, delivered with the cold, deliberate precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was an act of profound, public humiliation. I looked through the swinging kitchen door as it flapped open and saw a glimpse of the main pavilion. I saw Thomas. He was standing in a circle of men, investors in his new venture. He was adjusting his cufflinks, smiling, and then he looked up. And for a fraction of a second, his gaze met mine. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, panic or shame, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head and turned back to his conversation. Laughing, he had seen me, and he had chosen to do nothing. A server, an older woman with kind, weary eyes, approached and poured me a glass of champagne without a word. I sat down, my movement slow, the silk of my dress rustling against the simple wooden chair. The cold weight of the champagne flute in my hand was the only thing that felt real. In that small, overheated room, I finally understood. I was not the matriarch. I was not the founder of the company that was paying for this spectacle. I was an obstacle that had been neatly, quietly, and efficiently moved out of the way. But as I sat there, a strange calm washed over me. The shock receded, and in its place, a cold, hard clarity began to form. This was not the end of the story. It was simply the end of my illusions. The swinging door was a rhythmic interruption, a constant flap of light and sound each time it opened. It brought with it a sliver of the world I was supposed to be a part of. I sat perfectly still, an island of composure in a sea of frantic activity. I did not drink the champagne. I simply watched, my mind piecing together the events of the past few months with the brutal evidence of the present. Then, the door swung open and stayed ajar. Through the gap, I heard her voice. It was Jessica, her tone bright and brittle with triumph. She was standing just out of my sight, speaking to one of her bridesmaids. "Can you believe it's all finally happening?" the bridesmaid gushed. "I told you it would," Jess replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's all about managing the assets correctly. The wedding, the house, the company, even the mother." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Tucking her away back here was a stroke of genius. No drama, no scenes. It's the perfect solution." The bridesmaid giggled. "What's next? Then world domination." "Close," Jess said, her voice dropping. "The real work starts after the honeymoon. Thomas is still being sentimental about the company's risk profile. He's hesitant to leverage its full value." There was a pause. "But he's coming around. I've convinced him that his mother's way of doing business is antiquated. Once we get back from Bali, he'll finally agree to put up the core assets of Davenport Designs as collateral for the Sterling Tower project. We can't build an empire by thinking small. The old guard has to make way for the new vision." The door swung shut, and the voices were gone. But her words remained. hanging in the stuffy air like toxic fumes. Antiquated. The old guard. It wasn't just about sidelining me, and it was about consumption. She intended to gut my company, to gamble the solid, stable foundation I had spent a lifetime building on a monument to her own ego. And my son, my Thomas, was her willing accomplice. The last vestiges of grief inside me evaporated, burned away by the cold fire of her words. What remained was not anger. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. What I felt was a profound, serene clarity. The board was clear. The players had revealed their strategy. They had mistaken my quiet dignity for weakness. They had mistaken my willingness to step back for an invitation to be pushed aside. They had fundamentally misunderstood who I am. In that cramped, noise room, I had never felt more alone. And yet, I had never felt more powerful. I placed the untouched champagne flute on the table. My hands were perfectly steady as I reached into my small silk clutch and took out my phone. Its familiar weight was a comfort. I did not need to look through my contacts. I knew the number by heart. The number of the one man I trusted to understand not just the rules of the game, but the importance of winning it. My finger pressed the screen, and the phone began to ring. The phone rang twice, each electronic tone a sharp, clean sound that cut through the chaotic symphony of the kitchen. I listened to it, my own heartbeat steady, my breathing even. This was not a decision made in haste. It was a conclusion, reached at the end of a long and painful equation. The answer had been presented to me in the form of an empty chair and a whispered conspiracy. And I was now simply acting upon the data I had been given on the third ring. He answered. His voice was exactly as I knew it would be: calm, deep, and devoid of surprise. Harrison Blackwood had been my lawyer for 30 years. But he was more than that. He had been my late husband's closest friend. And he understood that for me. Davenport Designs was not merely a business, it was a living thing. Catherine, he said. There was no question in his voice, only a quiet readiness. He knew I would not be calling him in the middle of my son's wedding reception unless the matter was of the utmost gravity. Harrison, I replied, my voice as steady as his. I apologize for the hour. I need you to execute a directive for me. I did not need to raise my voice to be heard over the clatter of a dropped tray of cutlery nearby. My words were for him alone. A private command that would soon have very public consequences. I could picture him in his study, the room paneled with the dark cherry wood I had chosen for him decades ago. The phone held to his ear as he listened. Of course, he said simply. I'm listening. I want you to file the necessary injunctions to immediately pull all financial guarantees and collateral assets provided by Davenport Designs to any and all joint ventures bearing the name Morgan Davenport. I stated, the words precise and clinical. This includes the preliminary funding agreement for the Sterling Tower project. I want our position fully exited, effective immediately. I used the language of the boardroom. This was not a family matter anymore. It was a business decision, a necessary amputation to save the whole. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, not of shock, but of process. I could hear the faint sound of him tapping on a keyboard. The swinging door flapped open, and for a moment, the sound of the band playing a cheerful song flooded the room. I saw Jess and Thomas on the dance floor, his arms around her waist, her head thrown back in laughter. They looked untouchable, golden in the warm light. The door swung shut, and the image was gone. Catherine, Harrison's voice came back, measured and serious. The markets are closed, but I can have the notices of intent drafted and time-stamped within the hour. The digital withdrawal of your capital guarantee, however, can be initiated almost instantly. Are you certain you want to proceed with that immediacy? The fallout will be significant. It was the only question he asked. A final confirmation to ensure I understood the magnitude of the switch I was about to flip. I am more certain than I have been about anything in a very long time, Harrison. I said, proceed. Understood, he replied. Consider it done. The call ended. I lowered the phone and slid it back into my clutch. A gentle click as the magnetic clasp closed echoed the finality of my decision. A chapter of my life, the one where I believed my son would be the faithful steward of my legacy, had just ended. In its place, a new one had begun. I felt no triumph, no anger, and no sadness. What I felt was the quiet, profound relief of a great weight being lifted, the burden of hope, of misplaced trust, was gone. I stood up from the small, lonely table. The kind eyed server who had brought me the champagne was watching me. She gave me a small, sympathetic nod, a silent acknowledgement between two women who understood what it meant to be invisible. I nodded back and then turned, not toward the party, but toward the unmarked service exit. There would be no dramatic confrontation. My power, I now understood, was not in my presence, but in my absence. I had built the stage upon which they were performing. It was time to quietly dismantle it from behind the curtain. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool, dark embrace of the Oregon night. The air outside was cool and smelled of the sea, a clean, sharp scent that washed away the stale atmosphere of the kitchen. I walked along a gravel service path until I reached the guest parking area, far across the manicured lawns. The reception pavilion glowed like a lantern, a jewel box of light and music from which I was now an exile by choice. I could see the small, dancing figures inside, a world of celebration that felt utterly alien. For a moment, I allowed myself to watch them, a ghost at my own son's feast. The drive home was quiet, the winding coastal highway almost deserted. The headlights cut a tunnel through the darkness. My mind was not on the party, but on the mechanics of what I had set in motion. A capital guarantee from a firm like Davenport Designs was not just money. It was a foundation of stability upon which risky ventures were built. Removing it was like pulling the load-bearing walls out of a house in mid-construction. The collapse wouldn't be instantaneous, but it would be inevitable. I imagined the sequence of events with the calm precision of an architect. Harrison would make the call, a digital flag would be placed on the accounts, an automated alert, cold and impersonal, would be generated and sent to the primary account holders. It would be a single sentence, stripped of all emotion, informing the recipient of a critical change in their account status. Back in the glowing pavilion, the band would be playing its final set. Thomas, my son, would be at the center of it all, smiling, accepting congratulations. Then, in the midst of the noise, he would feel the vibration in his pocket. He would pull out his phone, a casual glance, annoyed at the interruption. His smile would falter. He would read the notification once, then twice. The words not making sense at first. Capital guarantee withdrawn, pending review. I could picture the color draining from his face. He would look around the room, his eyes wide with a dawning panic. This had to be a mistake. He would likely send a frantic text to his banker, who would not reply at this hour. And then, as the first wave of cold dread washed over him, his mind would search for an explanation, for the source of this sudden, catastrophic failure. His eyes would inevitably be drawn to the direction of the service hallway, to the little room where he had allowed his mother to be seated. He would look for me, perhaps to demand an explanation, perhaps to beg for a reprieve. He would walk quickly, weaving through the dancing guests, his face a mask of forced composure. He would push through the swinging door, expecting to find me sitting there. But all he would find would be an empty chair. He would see the untouched glass of champagne, the condensation beating on its sides. He would see the abandoned table, a small, insignificant piece of furniture in a forgotten room. But in that moment, that empty chair would be the loudest, most powerful object in his world. My absence would become a presence, a terrifying void where the foundation of his ambition used to be. The quiet woman he had so easily dismissed would now be the deafening silence at the heart of his crumbling empire. And in that silence, he would finally begin to understand the place I now occupied in his story. The morning after the wedding, I awoke to a profound and unfamiliar silence. It was not the silence of an empty house, for I was long accustomed to that, but the silence of a completed task, the quiet hum after a great machine has been switched off. I made coffee, the familiar ritual a steadying anchor in a world that had tilted on its axis. I walked through my garden as the Oregon mist, thick as spun wool, rolled in from the sea, clinging to the pine needles and rose bushes in a million tiny droplets. I sat at my drafting table, the smooth, cool wood a familiar comfort under my hands. But I did not draw. Instead, I simply looked out at the shifting grayness of the ocean, a reflection of the quiet turmoil within me. I did not check the news. I did not search for gossip. I simply existed within the quiet architecture of my own life, a life I had built and was now, it seemed, fated to protect. The storm I had unleashed was far away, and I felt no need to watch the lightning strike. I had designed the demolition, and I trusted the laws of physics to do the rest. My phone remained on the polished surface of the hall table, face down, a silent black monolith. Sometime in the late afternoon, it began to vibrate, a persistent, angry buzz against the wood that seemed to violate the newfound peace of the house. I glanced at the screen. The name Thomas glowed there, stark and demanding. I watched it for a long moment, feeling a faint, phantom ache in my chest, the ghost of a maternal instinct that refused to be entirely exorcised. A memory surfaced. Unbidden Thomas as a boy of 7, his face streaked with dirt, presenting me with a fistful of wildflowers he had picked from the meadow behind our first home. His earnest, trusting eyes. I let the phone ring until it fell silent. An hour later, it buzzed again, a new kind of urgency in its rhythm. This time, the name was Jessica. Her call I dismissed without a second thought, a simple, definitive swipe of my thumb. The calls continued for days, a frantic, alternating pattern of his number and hers, sometimes followed by a string of text messages whose previews I did not read. Each unanswered call was a brick being laid in a new wall, a boundary that had been transgressed and was now being fortified. I was not entirely cut off from the world. Harrison provided me with brief, factual updates, his emails stripped of all emotion, a cool recitation of consequences. The first major investor for the Sterling Tower project, a hedge fund manager I had known for years, had officially placed his 8-figure commitment on indefinite hold, citing a clause in his agreement that required full transparency and stability of all foundational assets. The primary construction firm, having been notified of the withdrawal of the Davenport guarantee, was now demanding a new surety bond for $10 million before a single shovel would break ground. The bank that held the primary loan for the land acquisition had scheduled an emergency covenant review. It was all happening exactly as I had known it would. The financial world, much like the natural world, abhors a vacuum. I had created one at the heart of their ambitions, and now everything was rushing in to fill the void. Anne was my window into the more personal side of the fallout. She moved through my house with her usual quiet discretion, bringing me tea, sorting the mail, a calming presence in the still air. She never asked directly, but she knew. One afternoon, as she was reviewing some correspondence from the office, she paused. "The design team sends their regards," she said softly. "Michael asked me to tell you that the office has felt calmer this past week." Michael was my head of design, a man of few words but deep loyalty. In that single, carefully chosen word calmer, I understood a volume. Jess's ambition had not just been aimed at me, it had been a disruptive force within the company I had built. A place known for its collaborative, respectful culture, her new vision was one of chaos and anxiety. My actions, it seemed, had not only protected my legacy, but also my work family. Anne continued, "I also heard from a contact at the airline. Their honeymoon in Bali was abbreviated. Flight manifests were surprisingly public things if you knew where to look. They were coming home. Not to a triumphant new life, but to the wreckage of their own making." I felt a deep, weary sadness for my son. I had given him every tool, every advantage, every opportunity to build something lasting. I had taught him that a structure's integrity is only as strong as its foundation. Instead, he had allowed himself to become a tool in someone else's hands, used to dismantle his own inheritance. I did not see this as my victory over him. I saw it as the inevitable, tragic consequence of his choices. I had not caused the house to fall, and I had simply stopped holding up the crumbling walls that he had allowed to decay. They had been back in Seacrest for a month of silence from my end, and I could only imagine frantic, panicked activity on theirs. I knew they were attempting to secure new lines of credit, to reassure investors, to project an image of unwavering stability in a world that feasts on the scent of weakness. In a city like ours, perception is reality, which is why, when the embossed ivory invitation for the annual Seacrest Museum Gala arrived, I knew I had to attend. It was the centerpiece of the city's social calendar, an event held in the grand, soaring atrium I had designed 2 decades ago. It was, in a very real sense, my home turf. To decline would be seen as a retreat, an admission of weakness or distress, and I was feeling neither. It was time to show them, and all of Seacrest, what true stability looked like. The night of the gala was cool and clear, the stars sharp and brilliant in the coastal sky. I chose a simple, elegant gown of deep navy silk, a color that spoke of quiet confidence, not of aggression. The only jewelry I wore was my mother's pearls. As I entered the museum, the familiar sight of the soaring, light-filled space greeted me like an old friend. The room was filled with the powerful and the influential, people whose homes I had designed, whose businesses I had advised, whose families I had known for generations. I was met with genuine warmth, with smiles of deep, abiding respect. They saw me not as a player in some recent drama, but as a permanent fixture, a part of the city's foundation. I moved through the room with ease, my calm a stark contrast to the undercurrent of tension that I knew my presence created. And then I saw her. Jess had made a bold, predictable choice. She wore a striking gown of bright, defiant red, her diamonds glittering aggressively under the soft lights of the atrium. She held a champagne flute like a weapon, her smile a little too wide, her laugh a little too loud. She was working the room with a desperate, frantic energy, moving from group to group, attempting to weave herself back into the social fabric that was rapidly unraveling around her. Thomas was a shadow at her side, his face pale and drawn, the easy confidence he once wore now replaced by a haunted, anxious look. He saw me from across the room, and for a moment, his eyes, so much like his father's, pleaded with me. But I offered him nothing. I gave a small, polite nod, as one would to a distant acquaintance, and turned back to my conversation with the museum's curator. The cold shoulder was a subtle art form in Seacrest, and it was being masterfully deployed against Jess. No one was overtly rude. That would have been uncivilized. But conversations would die down as she approached. People would smile politely, their eyes holding a distant, glassy look, and answer her questions with brief, non-committal words, before finding a sudden, urgent reason to be elsewhere that she was being quarantined, isolated by a silent, collective consensus in our world. Financial instability is a contagion, and no one wanted to be seen as exposed. The whispers followed in her wake, discreet but deadly. Her performance was flawless, but the audience was no longer buying tickets to her show. The defining moment of the evening, the final, brutal stroke of the social scalpel, was delivered by Eleanor, a formidable matriarch in her own right and one of my staunchest allies for over 50 years. We had come up together, two women navigating a world of men, and had forged a friendship built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. She was standing with me near the grand staircase, and we were sharing a quiet laugh about one of her audacious grandchildren. I saw Jess approaching, her bright smile fixed in place, clearly intending to break into our circle, to be seen with us, to borrow our credibility as if it were a string of pearls. Jess waited for a pause in our conversation and then stepped forward, her voice a cascade of forced warmth. Eleanor, Catherine, she said, you both look absolutely stunning tonight. I remained silent, my expression neutral, my gaze steady. Eleanor, however, did something remarkable. She did not even grant Jess a full glance. She simply let her eyes flick momentarily in Jess's direction, a look of mild, bored surprise, as if noticing a piece of lint on a sleeve, and then turned her gaze and her entire body back to me, her posture unbroken, creating a subtle but impenetrable wall. She placed a gentle hand on my arm. Now, Catherine, she continued, her voice clear and caring, as if there had been no interruption at all. You must tell me more about the scholarship fund you're planning. I heard it's for young women in architecture. A truly wonderful and necessary idea. It was the cut direct, a social execution performed with breathtaking, lethal precision. In that single, deliberate movement, Eleanor had erased Jess from the conversation, from the circle, from that entire stratum of society. She had made her invisible. I saw the bright, fixed smile on Jess's face falter, the confident light in her eyes flicker and die. For a fraction of a second, I saw raw, naked panic. She stood there, utterly alone in the middle of a crowded room, the invisible wall of their disapproval a palpable force. She recovered quickly, turning with a stiff, unnatural grace and walking swiftly toward the terrace. But the damage was done. Everyone who had been watching, and many had been, saw the queen of the new era be publicly and irrevocably dethroned. I watched her go, the flash of red disappearing into the darkness of the night. I felt no surge of victory, no malicious glee. What I felt was a somber understanding of the natural order of things. Reputations, like buildings, require strong foundations. They cannot be built on stolen ground with borrowed materials. Jess had tried to build her empire on my land, using my name as her foundation, and my son as her contractor. And tonight, in the full view of the world that mattered to her, she had discovered that the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. The most devastating collapses, I reflected, are often the most silent ones. They don't begin with a roar, but with a quiet, decisive turn of a shoulder, a single unanswered call, and the profound, deafening silence of an empty chair. The weeks following the gala settled into a new kind of quiet. The frantic calls from Thomas and Jess had ceased, replaced by a tense, unnerving silence. I knew this was not the silence of surrender, but the quiet of a predator gathering itself for a final, desperate lunge. The social victory at the museum had been decisive, but I was architect enough to know that a beautiful facade means nothing if the underlying structure is not secure. Social standing was fluid, a legal document. However, was like steel and concrete, a foundation upon which a lasting structure could be built. The events of the past few months had been a warning. They had shown me the fragility of my own legacy, how easily the story I had spent a lifetime writing could be edited by those who did not hold the pen. It was time to set my story in stone. I called Harrison Blackwood and scheduled a meeting. His office was in the oldest part of the city, a historic building of stone and dark wood that exuded a sense of permanence, and the air inside smelled of old leather and aging paper. It was a space dedicated to order, precedent, and the unshakable power of the written word. Here, there were no shifting aesthetics, there were only the solid, binding articles of law. Harrison greeted me not with sympathy, but with the crisp, focused attention of a trusted counsel. He knew we were here to build. We sat across from his large mahogany desk. Harrison, I began, my voice clear. I want to restructure my entire estate. I want to draft a new will and establish an irrevocable trust. He nodded slowly. I anticipated this. What do you have in mind, Catherine? Davenport Designs, I said, will be placed into a managed trust upon my passing. Its profits will serve a single purpose. I leaned forward, the vision clear in my mind. I want to create the Catherine Davenport Foundation. Its sole mission will be to provide full scholarships and grants to young women from underprivileged backgrounds who wish to study architecture and design. I explained my reasoning. Speaking of my own early days, of the struggle to be taken seriously in a world of men, I built this company so that I would never have to ask for a seat at anyone else's table. I told him, the foundation will ensure that generations of young women will have the resources to build their own tables. 2. My legacy would not be a static monument of wealth for one man to squander. It would be a living engine of creation. Then, we spoke of Thomas. This was the harder part, the necessary act of maternal love that felt, on the surface, like a punishment. Thomas is my son, and I will not see him destitute. I said, a separate, smaller trust will be established for him. It will provide him with a generous living allowance, enough to live comfortably, to have a home. The trust will be managed by an independent trustee, and the principal will be untouchable. He will be cared for, but he will not be in control. Harrison understood the distinction immediately. You are giving him a safety net, but not a sword, he said, perfectly summarizing my intent. Exactly, I affirmed. I was protecting my son from his own worst impulses, the ones fanned into flame by Jessica's ambition. For the next 2 hours, we worked. Harrison's pen flying across legal pads as he translated my vision into the precise, unassailable language of the law. We built clauses like retaining walls and established bylaws like steel frames. At the end, when I signed the preliminary documents, my hand did not shake. Each stroke of the pen was a declaration my story was, once and for all, my own. The silence from their side of the city lasted for another 2 weeks. I knew it was the quiet before a final assault. News of a restructured estate travels quickly. Their last hope for regaining control was not to earn it, but to take it by force. The expected call came from Harrison late on a Friday afternoon. His voice was calm but prepared. Catherine, he said, I have received a letter of inquiry from a law firm representing Mr. Thomas Davenport and Jessica Morgan. They are seeking to arrange an independent medical evaluation of you, with the eventual aim of petitioning the court to have Thomas appointed as your legal guardian, citing concerns over your erratic and impulsive financial decisions. So, there it was. The final, ugliest gambit. Not a hostile takeover of the business, but a hostile takeover of my very mind. They were going to try to paint me as a confused, senile old woman. I felt a surge of something cold and heavy in my chest, but it was not fear. It was a weary, profound disappointment in the son I had raised. They are more foolish than I had imagined. I said, what is our next move, Harrison? Our next move, he replied, a hint of steel in his tone, was made months ago. I believe it's time to show them our preparations. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? I suggest we invite your son and his counsel to join us. The next morning, I walked into Harrison's conference room. At the far end sat Thomas and Jess, with a slick-looking lawyer I did not recognize. Thomas would not meet my eyes. Jess stared at me with cold, defiant fury. I gave them a slight, neutral nod and took the seat opposite them. Good morning, Harrison began, his voice filling the room with quiet authority. We are here to discuss your concerns regarding my client's competency. I believe we can address these efficiently. He gestured to Anne, who stood and placed a thick, leather-bound binder in the center of the table. My client has always been a proponent of meticulous documentation. We have, therefore, prepared a portfolio for your review. He opened the binder. Let me begin with your primary concern, Ms. Davenport's mental state. He slid a document across the table. This is a full neuropsychological evaluation of my client, conducted 3 weeks ago by Dr. Alistair Reed, the head of geriatric psychiatry at the State University. It was a voluntary, comprehensive, 8-hour examination, as you can see from the conclusion on page 32. Dr. Reed finds Ms. Davenport to be in the 99th percentile for cognitive function in her age group. With exceptional strategic thinking and memory recall, his professional opinion is that she is, and I quote, as sharp as a tack. Jess's lawyer paled slightly. Thomas sank lower in his chair. Now, as to the erratic financial decisions, Harrison continued. Turning a page, this is a log meticulously kept by Ms. Anne Michaels, detailing a pattern of behavior by Miss Morgan. He began to read in a calm, dispassionate voice. An entry from March details the unauthorized rebranding of a signature collection. An entry from May documents an attempt to use corporate funds for a personal couture wardrobe. Here, in June, we have the matter of the family heirlooms, requested under false pretenses. He went on, his voice a steady drumbeat of documented facts. Finally, he turned to the last section. And this, he said, is a full financial audit of the Morgan Davenport joint ventures, revealing a projected burn rate that would have rendered Davenport Designs insolvent within 5 years. Miss Davenport's decision to withdraw her collateral was not impulsive. It was, as this independent auditor's report concludes, the only fiscally responsible and prudent course of action. He closed the binder with a soft, definitive thud. We have, of course, already prepared our own petition for damages related to this malicious attempt to seize control of my client's assets. However, Miss Davenport is a pragmatic woman. She is prepared to forgo that action, provided your own petition is withdrawn by the end of business today. The silence in the room was absolute. The slick lawyer was staring at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. Jess's face was a mask of disbelief. Her world dismantled, piece by documented piece. She looked at Thomas, her eyes blazing. But for the first time, my son did not look back at her. He was looking at me. And in his eyes, I saw the full, crushing weight of his defeat. I had not raised my voice. I had simply allowed the truth, in its most organized and undeniable form, to be presented. They had come for a battle, armed with lies. But they found the fortress doors wide open. And inside, not a terrified old woman, but an army of facts, standing in silent, perfect formation, the strongest fortresses. I reflected as I stood to leave. Are not the ones that can withstand a bitter siege. They are the ones so well designed that the enemy, upon seeing the blueprints of their own certain defeat, chooses never to attack at all. The meeting in Harrison's office was the last time I saw my son for many months. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not the tense, strategic silence of a Cold War, but the vast, empty silence of a great chasm that had opened between us. Life, however, abhors a vacuum. And so, I filled that silence with purpose. I threw myself into the creation of the Catherine Davenport Foundation. And in doing so, I discovered a passion I had not felt since the early days of building my company. This was not about balance sheets and profit margins. It was about building something else entirely. It was about building futures. I spent my days reviewing applications from brilliant young women whose talent was matched only by their financial need. Their stories were a poignant echo of my own past. Their dreams a powerful reminder of why I had started this journey in the first place. I read of a girl from a forgotten mill town who sketched architectural wonders on diner napkins, of a young immigrant who wanted to design sustainable housing for her community. These were not the hollow, glittering ambitions of Jessica. This was the real, solid, foundational work of changing the world, one blueprint at a time. I found a new rhythm to my days, a new sense of peace in my work. The wounds of the past had not vanished, but they were now scar tissue, strong and resilient. The foundation for the new structure I was building in my own life. The autumn rains began to fall, washing the last of the summer's warmth from the Oregon coast. It was on one such evening, with a storm lashing against the windows of my study, that I heard the sound of the heavy iron knocker on my front door. It was a sound so unexpected that for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Anne had gone home for the evening, and I was alone, surrounded by the quiet comfort of my books and the roar of the wind and sea. I walked to the door, a sense of cautious curiosity overriding any apprehension. When I opened it, he was standing there, a solitary figure illuminated by the porch light, with the darkness and the driving rain behind him. It was Thomas, but it was a version of my son I had never seen before. The sharp, bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a simple, worn jacket and jeans. The confident, almost arrogant, set of his shoulders had slumped into a weary posture of defeat. His face was thin and pale. His eyes, once so bright with ambition, were now hollowed out by exhaustion and something else, a deep, profound shame. He was drenched from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, and he looked not like a fallen prince, but like a lost boy who had finally found his way home after a long and terrible journey. He did not speak immediately. He just stood there, meeting my gaze for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, letting me see the full extent of his unraveling. "May I come in?" he finally asked, his voice rough, almost a whisper. I stepped aside and let him pass. He stood awkwardly in the grand foyer he had grown up in, a place he had once commanded with such easy ownership. Now looking like a stranger, he dripped rainwater onto the marble floor. "Jess is gone," he said, not as an excuse, but as a simple statement of fact. "She left a week after the meeting at Harrison's office. She said I had failed her." She was right. He looked around the silent house, his eyes lingering on the portraits of his father and grandparents. She didn't understand. She thought the power was in the money, in the name. She never realized that the foundation of this family, the foundation of everything you built, was made of something else entirely. He finally turned to face me fully, and I saw the tears welling in his eyes, tears he did not try to hide. "I am sorry, Mom," he said. And the word, once so simple, now carried the weight of 1,000 betrayals. "I'm not just sorry for the wedding, for that horrible, unforgivable moment in the kitchen. I am sorry for all of it, for letting her poison my thinking, for being so blinded by the idea of a bigger, faster empire that I was willing to tear down the kingdom you built with your own 2 hands. I forgot that you were a builder. I forgot that I was a builder's son." He faltered, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw that empty chair," he continued, "I finally understood. I had spent a year helping her push you out, making you smaller, trying to turn you into a portrait on the wall. But when you were actually gone, the emptiness was deafening. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I had everything I thought I wanted, and I had nothing at all." He was not making excuses. He was offering a confession, a full accounting of his own weakness and folly. He was taking responsibility. He reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges soft and frayed. He unfolded it. It was the crayon drawing he had made as a small boy and the stick figure of me with a hammer, the one he had brought to my door after the wedding. "This is all I have left that feels real," he said, his voice cracking. "I am not here to ask for my inheritance. I am not here to ask for a place at the company. I know I have no right to any of it. I am here to ask if you can teach me how to build something like this again. Something true. I don't know how." I looked at my son, the man standing before me, stripped bare of all his false ambition, and I saw the boy he used to be. The wound he had inflicted was deep, and it would never fully disappear. Forgiveness, I knew, was not a simple act of erasure. It was not about wiping the slate clean and pretending the damage had never been done. It was a conscious, difficult choice to stop letting the past dictate the future. It was about deciding whether a broken thing was worth the effort of rebuilding. I did not offer him a hug. I did not offer him easy words of comfort. The path back from where he had been had to be built, not gifted. "The person who built that," I said, my voice quiet but firm as I gestured to the drawing, "did it by getting her hands dirty. She did it by showing up, day after day, and laying one brick perfectly on top of another. There are no shortcuts." I told him about the foundation. I told him about its first project, a dilapidated community center in the most neglected neighborhood in Seacrest, a place long forgotten by the city's developers. It needed new wiring, a new roof, new walls, new hope. "The foundation has the funds for the materials," I explained. But we need a project manager, someone to be on site every day, to coordinate the volunteers, to swing a hammer, to prove that they are committed to building something for people other than themselves. It's unpaid, it's difficult, and it is the only job I have to offer. I saw a flicker of the old Thomas, a flash of pride and hesitation. The job was so far beneath the life he had known, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of humble, grateful acceptance. He simply nodded, the tears now flowing freely down his face. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said. A month later, I visited the site. The change was remarkable. The skeletal frame of the old building was now bustling with life. The air was filled with the sound of saws and hammers, with the smell of fresh lumber and wet paint. A diverse group of community volunteers worked alongside skilled tradespeople, their laughter mixing with the sounds of construction. And in the center of it all, covered in sawdust, a tool belt around his waist, was Thomas. He was thinner. His hands were calloused. But he moved with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen in him since he was a young man. He was explaining a set of blueprints to a group of teenage volunteers, his voice patient and clear. He saw me watching and walked over, a tired but genuine smile on his face. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. His work was speaking for him. We stood there for a long time, side by side, simply watching the act of creation. The late afternoon sun streamed through the open framework of the walls, catching the dust in the air and turning it into a shower of gold. It was a beautiful, honest light. I looked at him, at the son I was getting to know all over again. The foundation between us was still new, the ground still settling, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt solid. "You look like your father when you hold a blueprint like that," I said quietly. He looked down at the roll of paper in his hands, then back at me, his eyes clear. "I hope so," he said. Do you think this is a good design?" I looked at the plans, at the clean lines that promised shelter and community. Then I looked at the bustling construction site, at the hopeful faces of the volunteers, at the son who was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding his own life from the ground up. "Yes," I said, "it's a very good design. It has a strong foundation." We stood together, no longer a matriarch and a disgraced heir, but two builders looking at a blueprint for the future, ready to rebuild what was broken, one brick at a time.